Washington State and Oregon State have only waded through the wilderness for a year, but that's a year too long. I think it's time. This is Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Big 12. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. That is Andy Patton, our Pacific Northwest Locked On guru and host of Locked On College Basketball, who's here to make the case today that Washington State and Oregon State, the Big 12, is not just on the table, but something that will happen in the coming years. I think Gonzaga to the Big 12 in hoops, is that going to happen? Andy, let's start right there. Washington State, Oregon State will get a spot in the Big 12. If that's the statement, you're the defense attorney. How do you back it up?
Well, I think the fan bases for these two programs are just massive and gigantic and passionate. The football success that both of these programs have had recently, I think, is something that should drive a lot of attention. And, you know, Bill Walton, we all love Bill Walton. We know what he loves to say. He talks about truck stop conferences. He talks about the Pac-12, the former Pac-12 being like this not truck stop conference. And the issue with that statement has always been Oregon State and Washington State, because these two programs are in these small cities that don't generate a lot of traffic. They're not these, big metropolitan areas. Pullman, Washington is just this tiny little town, 75 miles south of Spokane, when the biggest city anywhere close to you is Spokane and the second biggest is Boise. Like, there's just not a lot of size and interest there. And I think that is hurting Washington State. But despite that, this is a program that has a huge, passionate, loyal fan base, a huge alumni base. They've had massive success. They've brought in tremendous coaches from both the football and the men's basketball perspective. Tony Bennett was there. Mike Leach was there. The list goes on and on. This is a program that has had not just recent success, but really sustained success from a football and men's basketball. Less so. It's been a bit up and down. The future for them right now is a lot murkier after Kyle Smith leaves. But the program itself is so has managed to succeed despite a lot of things that seemingly would work against them. And I don't really have any doubt whatsoever that if they were put in the Big 12, that they would immediately find ways to succeed. From a football perspective, the men's basketball might take them a little bit longer, but the football, I think, would be there right away. I mean, the team that's been ranked nationally multiple years in a row. And Oregon State, the sustained success hasn't been there as much, but Corvallis is a really passionate fan base as well. The rivalry they've had with Oregon has been fantastic, and we've seen this team really kind of step up and deliver, especially the last 2 years under Jonathan Smith, ranked both of the last two seasons inside the top 20 from a football perspective. The men's basketball is much farther behind, but again, if we're talking about this from a football perspective, the Big 12 would get two programs that have been ranked nationally in each of the last 2 years that have just an incredible appetite from their fan base for success. And I think that people who maybe haven't watched a lot of these teams, who are in bed when they play, who think, they're only ranked because they're playing a bunch of, adequate, inferior Pac-12 schools, would be surprised at how competitive they would be able to be if they were to move to the Big 12.
What impresses me so much about, namely Washington State, is that fan pool that you mentioned and the Seattle area that fan base seems to command. And those are two towns in Pullman and Corvallis that feel like an Ames, Iowa. We're not that far off. And I understand that an Arizona State gives you a new market. Now you're tapping into that Phoenix area, but football-wise, what are you getting? What the Big 12 just added in Colorado, the pomp and circumstance of Dion probably goes away in a year. What are you actually adding? And Andy, to prove this whole point, I did an expansion poll, Locked On Big 12 expansion poll that had teams like Duke, Miami, North Carolina, Pitt, Louisville, and Washington State and Oregon State were the two squads that made it to the championship. They took 83% of these votes in the Twitter polls and are 50-50 in the championship as we speak, which, Brett Yormark's not watching Twitter polls to determine who is going to bring in the Big 12, but that just shows how passionate, how involved and engaged Washington State and Oregon State fans are. That's kind of where I want to go next with these fans. I mean, I can't imagine, as a power school fan, a power school alum, my team just getting left out entirely, having no apparent future here. I know we'll talk more specifically future later in the show, but as it sits, what is the aura around the two fan bases when you get left out?
I think it's desperation. They're definitely passionate, but I do think that when you look at the results there, it's a bit of desperation of we need to end up somewhere. And not only you mentioned the kind of sadness and how that would feel to see that happen, but The worst part, I think, for Oregon State and Washington State fans was how, like, it was just a long process. Like, it didn't happen overnight. For an entire year, they basically watched as they knew that the Big 12 was going to take the four corner schools. They knew that Oregon and Washington were going to go to the Big 10. Like, as soon as USC and UCLA made their move, this felt inevitable, but it took like 16 months until it finally happened. And as somebody has close friends who went to Oregon State, who went to Washington State, who's been to both campuses, like, I know how passionate these fan bases are. And I just watched them just sit there and stare for a year and a half, knowing that this was about to happen. Like, it's a horrendous feeling. I feel awful for them. Washington State watches their AD leave and go to Washington. I mean, What an incredible gut punch that would be for anybody to see your AD go take the job at the rival school. Like, it's just this, they've always felt like a little brother, both Oregon State and Washington State, to Oregon and Washington. And now they get left out in the cold while those two programs just leave them in the dust. It's a really horrible feeling for them. But the fan bases are still passionate. They're still devoted to their program. They still know how good their football teams are. And obviously, we've seen the transfer portal wreck both these programs since they've left. And why wouldn't you, if you were a player at those teams? Like, you're going to enter the transfer portal because you don't know who they're going to play next year or what it's going to look like in the future. And I don't blame the kids for doing that, but I certainly feel for the programs and the fan bases. And that's why they're like, if we get back in the Big 12, we know that it's a year, maybe two, and then we're right back in it. Like, there's not going to be a big lull period. They're not going to come into the conference and sit in the cellar for 5 years before they get their stuff together. They're going to be ready to roll right away because that fan base is going to pour money and energy and devotion into those teams to get them back into the thick of things in the Big 12. And I think that among anything else is a reason to say, let's bring them in, because they're going to come in as hungry as any team could possibly be coming into that conference.
One of the prevalent points, Andy, that gets brought up often is in expansion, we are working toward a hodgepodge, just this Pangea of teams. No conference will slow down anytime soon in adding programs, though the SEC seems to be staunch in keeping it where it is. Eventually, the way we've turned, everyone's going to have to add. And it looks like even a San Diego State or a Boise State, especially a Washington State, Oregon State, could be a byproduct of that, them going to the Big 12. And again, Washington State's TV viewership numbers are better than Arizona. We're better than Arizona State, a couple of Big 12 teams. And as we know, TV viewership in the football category is what pushes expansion down the line. Going down the line, where do these two end up? What is next for Washington State, Oregon State? That is next here on Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Look, Game Time is my favorite place to go when it is game time. I went to a Charles Wesley Godwin concert a couple nights ago, and that might mean zero to you, but it means a lot to me. I think he's very good, and I got $23 tickets. And the reason I got $23 tickets is because at Game Time, there are lower prices the closer you get to the event. Last-minute deals, save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, and comedy. Flash deals, save even more with exclusive in-app deals, all in price. You can toggle that feature, and there's no hidden fees at the very end of the show. Seat views, boom, panoramic view. I got to see, I was in the pit for $23. And the best part is, speaking of $23, you go to Game Time, you download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege, you get $20 off your first purchase. So that $23 concert ticket, that's $3. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, it's lowest prices, and that is guaranteed. Andy Patton of Locked On College Basketball and our Locked On Pacific Northwest expert, Oregon State, Washington State. What is next, man? We've talked about the Washington State athletic director goes to Washington. The Oregon State football coach jumps ship from Michigan State. A lot of the players want to go play power conference ball, and these two schools are sitting in almost a college football, college athletics purgatory. What do we do? Like, what is the best case scenario at this point?
I think the moves that they have made so far have been solid stopgap moves just to smooth things over temporarily. They're basically got this scheduling agreement with the Mountain West. That was a very obvious move, but I think a sensible one of like, we just need to find some games to get on our calendar next year, so we're not just like scraping for every single week trying to find a game to play. I think that makes sense. I think housing the rest of their programs in the WCC makes sense. It's a good basketball conference. It creates some natural like regional rivalries for some of the sports. I think the WCC doesn't get as much attention for the fact that it's a very good volleyball conference and a very good soccer conference and other sports that I think Oregon State and Washington State will fit naturally. But that is a temporary thing. It is a 2-year deal, and I would be stunned if they stay in the WCC beyond that, because it's not a football conference and they need to figure out something to do with their football teams. And so they're gunning to try to get into one of the Power Four, because some combination with the Mountain West, which I think is what is being talked about frequently, of like they'll just join the Mountain West full time and they'll just kind of create their own pseudo power conference. Like, that's not sustainable long term. Like you said, the major conferences are just trying to build and build and build. The Pac-12 is gone. The ACC is next. Like, why would this Mountain West thing be sustainable long term? And they know that. And I think that they're planning on, we have to figure out how to get into the Big 12, the SEC, or the Big 10. And the SEC is not adding anybody. The Big 10 doesn't want them, so they're gunning for the Big 12. And I think that makes sense, because at the end of the, they could jump to the ACC and then eventually get swallowed up by one of those 3 conferences down the line. Does it make sense to do that when you know that that's a short-term thing? Maybe it might. I mean, to be honest, if it's that or nothing, then I think you do it. But everybody kind of sees the writing on the wall here of there's 3 conferences. 2 of them have a ton of power in the SEC and the Big 10. The Big 12 is not going away for a long time, because Brett Yormark is a very forward-thinking person. And I think that's going to help that conference sustain itself. But the ACC doesn't feel long for this world. And I think if you're Oregon State and Washington State, you're figuring out, how do I get into one of those 3 conferences? I don't know if they will. I don't know if they have enough power to get into one of those conferences, but they shouldn't settle for anything other than that, because any other move has to be viewed through the lens of it being temporary. Because anything you're thinking long term, if it's not in those big 3 conferences, it's probably not long term.
To validate that, I'd take a Cal, Stanford, SMU, and it would be tough to say that Washington State and Oregon State are in a better spot than those 3. But given the trajectory and projections of that conference, I wouldn't mind being in the waiting room when those 3 teams are left out in the desert entirely, and they were the ones that took the chance on the ACC that died off. Andy, with that being said, for Oregon State and Washington State, what do you do when you're in the waiting room? I mean, how do you prepare in the next year, 2 years, to say, hey, Big 12, it's 2025, 2026. Here is what we offer. Take us.
It's a really tough situation to be in, because the best thing that they can do is to continue to have success on the football field, success in the basketball court, to still generate TV power, to still generate revenue for, like, fan base is showing up, donor base is there, NIL money is there, like, to demonstrate that you have that success. That's really hard to do when all of your coaches are leaving, when your players are leaving. I mean, Washington State was a 7 seed in the NCAA tournament last year. They had 13 players on that roster. One of them graduated. The other 12 all entered the transfer portal. Every single one of them left. Their coach, Kyle Smith, phenomenal basketball coach, he goes to Stanford. He leaves from Washington State to Stanford, which is effectively a WCC to ACC move, which feels incredibly baffling and weird, but that's what happened. And I don't blame Kyle Smith. I don't really blame the players for doing that. But if you're Washington State right now, like, the interest in the basketball program reached a crescendo, like a really high point since, Klay Thompson was there. And now, I mean, it's going to come crashing down. But the best thing they can do is prove that they still have sustainable success. That's just going to be really, really hard to do. Look, the fans are going to show up. The Pullman crazies, the people in Corvallis, the Portland area, Oregon State fans, the Seattle area, Washington State fans, they're going to show up. Win or lose, we booze. That's the Cougars mantra. It's been that forever. That is a program, a dedicated fan base that it's not going away. But at the end of the day, the TV numbers are going to drop. The talent on the field is going to drop, and they have to prove that they still have that dedicated core fan base in order to generate, like, that interest from the Big 12, from those other conferences. But they're in a really tough spot. I feel for them, because I think we know what they need to do is to demonstrate that they can still succeed. It's just, I mean, they're just being handed an incredibly raw deal in terms of trying to be able to do that.
Andy, from your perspective, if this had all happened 2 years prior and the Big 12 did not yet have a Cincinnati, a UCF, a Houston, is there a better shot Washington State and Oregon State already have a home in this conference?
Yes, I think so. I think if this had happened 2 years ago and the Big 12 was looking at, I think they still probably add Houston. I think Houston was an addition that makes a lot of sense. But if they're looking at Oregon State, Washington State versus Central Florida and Cincinnati, That's a lot closer. BYU in that mix as well. I think BYU makes a lot of sense for them as well. I think they probably still add them. But if they're adding like Houston, BYU, Oregon State, Washington State, that's probably a bit more compelling than Cincinnati and Central Florida. And I think that that's probably the direction that they would have gone. Again, if we're talking 2 years ago, does that mean Stanford, Cal are already in the ACC? If Stanford and Cal were options for the Big 12, would they just grab all four of them instead of grabbing Houston and Cincinnati? Or Houston and BYU, maybe. It's kind of hard to say at that point. SMU, again, would theoretically be in the mix there as well. But I do think Oregon State and Washington State, if it had happened at a time where the Big 12 hadn't already added those four schools and was already in the process of adding the four corner schools, I do think they would have generated a bit more interest. But because they got hung out to dry where everybody left except for them, it just puts them it makes them a lot less desirable. And there's not a whole lot they can do to rebuild that value, which is why there's so much frustration right now for those two fan bases.
Profitable. I mean, you have to be profitable in expansion to get an opportunity in a power conference. And I think Washington State, Oregon State, both are profitable enough to have made that jump if the conference hadn't have added those four when it did. And all of that came crashing down on the Pac-12 side a year and a half later. And speaking of profits, Gonzaga brings in a lot of money. The basketball is there, but football side doesn't bring in much at all. Let's talk about the opportunity for the Big 12 to add basketball-only schools moving forward, like a Gonzaga or a UConn. This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Look, if you are a competitive person, I've been called competitive myself multiple times, Monopoly Go is the place for you because you can play against your friends and beat your friends. Or if you're not a competitive person, I don't know what you're doing, but you can play with your friends, and that can be fun for you too if you're a maniac. Unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete big albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasures or robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events to help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. It's the classic Monopoly that you love, but now it is on the go right there on your little phone, on the app, on the Google Play, the App Store. Game on. Get off the bench. Download it today on the Google Play or the Google Play or the App Store, and it's Monopoly Go. Andy Patton of Locked On Zags, adding basketball-only schools to the Big 12, whether it's Mark Few's squad or a UConn, I think it's never going to happen. Qualify, defend, truth, fallacy. What say you?
Well, I think whenever this argument gets brought up, the first thing people mention is, well, they're not going to generate as much money as the football schools. And it's like, yeah, duh, yes. Like, I think that is a very obvious point that doesn't need to be hammered home because you're not offering a Gonzaga or a UConn or a program like that as much money. They're not going to take money from the football schools and not produce any money because they don't have football. That's not what's going to happen. Yep. The conversations that have happened between the Big 12 and Gonzaga, from what we have heard, there have been many conversations. Brett Yormark, basically every time the Big 12 says, hey, no, not right now, he says, okay, fine. And then 3 weeks later, he's like, what about now? What about now? What about now? It feels like that's kind of been the trend that we have seen. And Gonzaga has done a ton of research on their end to try to prove their worth. But ultimately, I think the start of the conversation is that this is not an addition that the Big 12 would make that would cost the schools as much money, the conference as much money. It would be a smaller addition because they're not playing football. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think people hear it and they think, well, they're not going to generate the same money that even a bad football program would be. So why would we add them if we're paying them the same amount? You're not paying them the same amount. You're paying them a smaller amount. And to reference the value of Gonzaga basketball from a TV perspective, like, it is huge. Like, it's really important to acknowledge how massive it is. Gonzaga's TV power over the last 10 years is fifth among all college basketball programs. The four programs in front of them, Duke, North Carolina, Kansas, Kentucky.
Decent.
That's a pretty good group of college basketball teams right there. Gonzaga is consistently one of the most watched college basketball programs in the country during the regular season, during the non-conference season, during the NCAA tournament. They're turning out more NBA players than every single team in the Big 12 except for Kansas. They are a dominant college basketball program. They are not just dominating in their conference. And I don't think anybody at this point, Gonzaga has kind of ascended past the point where people doubt their ability to win big games. They've been to 9 straight straight Sweet 16s. If anybody's still doubting that, I don't know what to tell them. They curb stomped Kansas in the NCAA tournament last year. Like, this is a team that has clearly proven they deserve to be where they're at and would clearly compete in the Big 12. I'm not saying they'd come in and win. I think they'd barely be a top 5 team this year, but that's a testament to the fact that Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Iowa State, and Arizona is an incredibly good group of teams. But they're generating a TV number that would rival every single team in the Big 12. And if you're looking at, if the schools are serious about adding value to your conference, paying a school like Gonzaga significantly less money to come into your conference to generate as much TV power as every team in your conference, like all of them right at the top, you're going to be getting the same numbers as Kansas and Baylor and Houston and all of those teams, if not more.
Yep.
If not more. If I'm the Big 12 and you can add a team that's probably going to get more eyeballs on your basketball than any other team you could conceivably add, and you're asking the schools to pay a third of what you're asking them to pay to add a team like Washington State or Oregon State, who aren't going to do anything during the basketball season. I mean, even if Washington State's good, like, they're not going to finish in the top 10 in the Big 12 90% of the time, and they're not going to generate any interest from a TV viewing perspective. Obviously, the football is significantly more, but you're paying 2 times as much for Washington State than you would for Gonzaga. You have to at least have that conversation. And I think you're probably right that the Big 12 it would take a lot for them to do this, but Gonzaga is desperate. They don't want to be left holding the bag. If/when the SEC and the Big 10 decide, hey, we're just not going to let mid-majors in the NCAA tournament anymore. Like, everybody thinks about, that affects the plucky schools like the Florida Gulf Coast or whatever. That affects a lot of programs, and it could affect Gonzaga. And it would kill Gonzaga. I mean, it would crush them if they weren't able to play in the NCAA tournament. They have to find a way to prevent that from happening, and getting into the Big 12 is a way to do that. And if you're looking at a desperate school that is willing to take a small amount of money and is going to generate more TV power than almost every school in your conference in the second most important sport, there's a very compelling argument there.
If the Pac-12 holds on for one more year, Gonzaga very well could be a Big 12 school. We know that Brett McMurphy and Ross Dellinger have had reports that Brett Yormark's been in the back pocket of Mark Few and company in Spokane for a while now, talking about whether or not that school can become a Big 12 entity. And UConn is even in that batch over the last decade. Andy, the pushback would be, I'm very interested to see how you, again, this is a tough question. It's a hypothetical, but it is what Brett Yormark asks is, hey, if Mark Few retires tomorrow, or if Gonzaga goes 3 years of bad basketball, that is a big if, a big hypothetical, but then where is the value? How do you defend a question like that?
It's a reasonable question. I would point out that Gonzaga hasn't had 3 bad years in a row in 25 years.
25 years, yeah.
I think I think that's a compelling point. And people will point to, like, okay, they've made the tournament 25 years in a row. But and I think there's this sentiment that, a lot of that time they only made it because they were just barely better than the rest of the teams in WCC. That's not really true. In the last 10 years, they would have made the tournament in almost any conference.
Yeah.
Pretty much every one of those years. There's been a few years where it was like, it was a little bit questionable, but most of the time they would have made the NCAA tournament. Having said that, yes, the Mark Few concern is valid. And I wish that, again, if we're talking a couple of years ago when Tommy Lloyd had not taken the job at Arizona, that might change the conversation, because everybody knew, okay, Tommy's next in line. When Mark Few retires, Tommy Lloyd's going to take over. And, that was the chatter around Gonzaga's sphere. And people outside of that were like, yeah, but is some assistant coach going to be able to take over that program and immediately lead them to success? Yes, he would have been. I mean, clearly, we look at what happened at Arizona. Yes, they haven't had sustained NCAA tournament success, but Tommy Lloyd's ability to recruit and to coach and get wins for that team have been tremendous. Now, Gonzaga doesn't necessarily have that guy on staff anymore. Brian Michelson has been there for 10 years. He played in the program 20 years ago. He's been around for a long time. Maybe he can step up and be that guy, but he doesn't have the same pedigree and the same kind of perception that somebody like Tommy Lloyd did. I think if Gonzaga does lose Mark Few, they maybe look at Leon Rice at Boise State, who was a coach at Gonzaga for 10 years. Leon Rice is a good coach who has never won an NCAA tournament game.
Yeah.
Like there, I mean, that's a much bigger risk. Mark Few seems like he's going to coach until the day that he dies, and that may be a long time from now. But it is fair to have that be a concern. But again, I would go back to the point of you're not pouring as much money into Gonzaga as you are as other programs. So yes, if Gonzaga takes a dip, if Gonzaga loses their coach, first of all, if Mark Few retires when they're already in the Big 12, they have a better chance of landing a good coach, which they wouldn't be able to do if they were in the WCC. So I think that they would still be able, the brand would be so successful. The alumni base is not huge, but they're funneling money into the program right now. You can tell by the transfer portal additions they're getting that they have the NIL funds to survive in this era. That would only increase in the Big 12. And I think that if they're in the Big 12 for 5 years before Mark Few retires, the program is in a solid enough spot that I don't think that you would see that dip or that fear or that concern. But I understand why it is a valid point to bring up right now while they're still not in the conference.
The reason I put Gonzaga and Connecticut together is because Connecticut just doesn't have football. I mean, if we're really transparent here, both schools play about the same brand of football. And UConn is 50th in the nation in revenue numbers, right behind Kansas State, who's 49th. And that's playing in the Big East in basketball and playing, in essence, without a football team. When you have a basketball program of the two profitable sports in the country that is that profitable, and Gonzaga's right there with you, there is value in adding them to the Big 12. And I do think, again, as we become a Pangea hodgepodge of, I'll take you and you and you, and let's just try to make more TV money, those schools are going to be on the table for a conference like the Big 12. Andy, Pat, before we get out of here, if folks want to find more of your content on Locked On College Basketball or Locked On Zags, where do they go? What do you got going on?
Yeah, wherever you find Locked On Big 12, you can find Locked On College Basketball. We're 5 days a week. It's myself, my co-host, Isaac Shade. It's one of us hosting every single show. We're talking transfer portal stuff right now. We're starting to get into some NBA draft profiles as well. Again, it's every single day. Even if the season is long over, we're still talking over there. Locked On Zags, same stuff every single day, talking about conference realignment, talking about the transfer portal, whatnot. I also do some writing about college basketball for USA Today's College Sports Wire, so you can find that there as well. It's a lot of college basketball content, so if you're into hoops, definitely come check it out.
Which it's the Big 12. Of course we're into hoops, Andy. This is our backyard. And on my Spotify, which is where I go to listen to Locked On Anything, it says under Big 12, hosts' favorite shows, Locked On College Basketball, because it's my second listen every day right after Locked On Big 12. Speaking of, come back on Monday. We'll give you even more content on the transfer portal right now. Expansion, as it's an ever-changing world across the college landscape, and the ACC is being sued by 3 people, which is not good for them. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. No se grande.